Okay, Assalamu alaikum. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. It's so nice to be back in person. And look, the impact of my travels. I made Sheikh wear a mask. I'm so sorry. We have, because we're trying to be really careful about Sheikh's health. We're careful about COVID, and so when we travel and we have people here, I'm going to wear a mask for a few days. And so since I wanted to speak without my mask, I made Sheikh wear a mask. So anyway, it's a group effort, so it works. But alhamdulillah, it was really, I honestly was like a little bit nervous about leaving like the Usuli bubble, because there's such, a visceral, palpable blessing when we're here together. And, whether it's, when we're in the halakas or just in the space with other people here, you feel like you're doing something really divine. And so, you're just like, I was nervous about leaving and kind of leaving that bubble of blessing. And, and also it's a little bit like kind of jumping out of the nest with your wings, and like all the stuff you've learned and trying to figure out how to apply it. And, and going back to, in my case, I went back to visit my parents in my childhood home, and kind of visiting old haunts that I hadn't been back to for 12 years, at least to my parents' home, and then back to Palo Alto where I grew up. The last time I was there, I actually didn't really even look around to see what had changed. So in Palo Alto proper, I hadn't been, legitimately back for probably almost more than 20 years. So, and like the growth of Facebook and just, it was a completely different experience. And so, it's a little bit surreal to go back home and see everything completely changed. And I was driving past familiar places, my high school, friends' homes, like places I didn't even recognize anymore because it was just completely different. And I was telling some of the people here that, when you're like kind of jumping out of the nest and trying to think about like, okay, what has the last 6 months done in changing my perspective on things? What have I learned and what can I apply? It was also really shocking, to go back and see, obviously things are opening up for the first time with after COVID, and California was like literally I think the day after we arrived, or the 15th, 2 days after we arrived, they passed a thing that everything is back to normal, and so people didn't have to wear masks anymore, restaurants were open. It was just like all of a sudden it was as if a pandemic didn't occur. So that was sort of shocking because it's like you don't really quite know what to do. You're used to operating in a certain way, and people are so excited to pretend there's no more pandemic, and so it was a little bit disconcerting. And it was also hard because I had not seen my parents for, since before the lockdown, so it had been more than a year, and we could definitely see the passage of time and the passage of age, and so these are these things that you really reflect upon, and I think when I think about the time away, one of the most important lessons is just how quickly things change, and whether it's what you expect your childhood home to be, what you expect your parents to look like, act or feel like to you, and just how you respond even, it was a real eye-opening experience, but also such an incredible blessing, because I think normally when you see that kind of change, it's very devastating and it's very unsettling. And I think what we've learned here in this space has been very reassuring, that when you see a lot of change and when you see how fragile things are, even the fragility of life and your parents, and just how what you expect in your mind to be there is no longer there. I think unless you understand that this is all a test, that God is the one thing that's stable and strong, that carries you through. If you don't have that, I think it's very easy to feel extremely anxious and nervous and worried. And it was interesting too, because I had, we're not big vacation people, so vacation has never been part of our vocabulary, as we joke here. People will say the word and I'll be like, what does that mean? And usually our vacations have always been like, there's a lecture to give somewhere or some work to be done, and then in some spare time, maybe we'll go to the bookstore, or we'll see a movie or something like that, or visit with family. So the rest is always an afterthought. So it was very unusual for me to be in a time and space where I got to actually just do what I wanted without, you know, having to worry. And I chose to spend that time with friends and reconnecting with people that, you know, mean a lot to me in California. So I got to see Rafida, who's online here, and we got to spend a few hours together, you know, and each of my friends like that I saw, I truly treasure, and I honestly got to spend like serious time, you know, like when you can be with someone for 2 or 3 hours, you really get to connect and catch up, and it was really beautiful. And the really interesting thing is, you know, several of those friends are not Muslim, but they're like among some of the most beautiful people on the planet that I know, and it like really struck me. I wish I could bring all of these people together, you know, hopefully inshallah one day when COVID is over, because I feel like all of these people would love one another because they're just amazing. But one of them, who I spent a lot of time with and who knows us very well, the professor and I, we got on a conversation about what we were doing here at Project Illumine, and she knew generally what we were doing, but I got a chance to really, you know, dig deep and tell her about what was going on. And the story, you know, she had gone through some hard times, and she was sharing with me how one night she had gone home to her apartment and was feeling down, very sad, not suicidal, but to the point where it was like, what is the point of my life? And, you know, I've been through a lot of difficulty, and, you know, she was crying as she was telling me this story. And then she said that at that moment she was sitting at her desk, and all of a sudden a ladybug appeared. And she understood, like I didn't realize this, but, you know, she was explaining to me, yeah, you know, ladybug is sort of a symbol of life, and, you know, and that at that moment she was like, huh, you know, it's so interesting. And then she took it on her finger and took it outside and let it go. And I said, see, you know, like, and that, you know, she said that like thinking about it, it felt like, oh, maybe this was like a divine sign. And then she said to herself, no, but why would, you know, how could that be? And I said, exactly, that's what we're learning, is the idea that, you know, if you really believe, and she does believe, but I think she's of that you know, sense that, well, why does God care about me? You know, why would God take the time to send me a ladybug as a sign? You know, and so I had an opportunity just to tell her, you know, and thank God, you know, she's not Muslim, but I can be honest with her and tell her what I really think. And I said, you know, I always feel like these sorts of tests and challenges are, you know, God reaching out to you and saying, you know, trust me, think about me, come to me, you know, and of course God would send you. If you really believe that God is engaged in your life and knows every little thing and is with you every moment and knows how you feel, which is what we talk about here all the time, that of course God would send you a ladybug, because that would mean something to you. Like, she understood that a ladybug was a symbol of life. I didn't understand that, so I don't think God would send me any ladybugs. But, you know, it was just, you know, and I was so happy because after our conversation, she sent me a message after we left that I really made her think, and that was something that that struck her and gave her an idea, and gave her some hope. So that made me happy, you know. And those are the kinds of things that I always feel like, okay, if I can share a little bit of what we're doing, even to someone who's not Muslim, to have them reconsider the idea of God and the closeness of God, and, you know, and how there's always hope, then that to me is very, you know, it's a beautiful byproduct of what we're doing here. So alhamdulillah, and I always get excited when I share with people what we're doing. And, you know, I mean, I hope I can be even a role model to people when I can't even really talk about, you know, I'm mindful, like when I'm not with Muslims, I'm really careful not to, like, you know, be, you know, proselytizing, or, you know, like, you know, I don't want to make anyone uncomfortable, and try to just more be through, like, you know, my example, I guess, or just normal and, you know, hopefully thought-provoking. And so it was really lovely just to spend time with the women there and all of that. So anyway, but the nut of it is, you know, I think it's really important to just always think back on these sorts of experiences, and like, what, you know, what did you learn from your travel, and you know, how can you improve yourself as a person. And honestly, it's just like the gratitude. I think coming back from seeing the change in everything, reconnecting with people that I really love, just feeling like grateful for every little thing, and just being very mindful of the passage of time and the fragility of life, and to just appreciate everything in the moment, and not to sweat the, you know, the little stuff that, you know, people spend so much time and energy just being focused on little things that can, you know, push them on a path of negativity. And again, that's wasted time. You know, it's like you just want to really appreciate and value every moment that you have with the people that you love. So anyway, so I'm so happy to be back, because I, you know, I, you know, also you really appreciate what you have every day when you don't have it, you know. And so I'm happy to come back, and I'm very grateful to be here. So, alhamdulillah. And also, I had the experience of being on the interactive group, which is very different. So I got some ideas from being there, and so you know, it was really great. So, alhamdulillah. Anyway, okay, looking forward to another wonderful session, and thank you for everyone here that really stepped up and helped me, you know, get away, because it is hard to kind of, you know, unstuck yourself from all the things that you have to do and, you know, take some time away. So I'm really grateful for the wonderful community here, everyone who stepped up and took care of Sheikh and the dogs and everything. So anyway, alhamdulillah.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Subhanallah al-Ali al-Azim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalam ala Muhammad. المرسل رحمة للعالمين خاتم الأنبياء أجمعين وعلى آله وأصحابه واتبعوا بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. اللهم اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي يا رب. Okay, inshallah, today Surah Al-Haqqah. There are cumulative reports that Al-Haqqah was a surah revealed right after Surah Al-Mulk. And we talked about Surah Al-Mulk. And interestingly, Al-Haqqah is also reported to have been revealed right before Surah Al-Ma'arij. Which is interesting, but we'll leave that till later. So if Al-Haqqah is revealed after Surah Al-Mulk, then in order of revelation, it would be, in terms of the number of surah, it would be in the late 70s. Maybe 77, 78, 79, something like that. And it would, like Sajda and like Al-Tur and like Al-Mulk, it would be a post-Isra surah. And a surah that is revealed towards the end of the Meccan period, as we approach the end of the Meccan period. And this makes Surah Al-Haqqah interesting in several regards, because thematically it looks like it's addressing what has already been addressed in the earlier Meccan surah. The hereafter, accountability, punishment, and the fate of past nations. And it's a fairly short surah, so that would pretty much be the main focus of the surah. But as we said before, that these series of short surah, there's about 6 of them that are revealed right before the Hijrah. And like Surah Al-Mulk, they seem to underscore a quintessential point, like a fundamental point. It's literally you have training for people that are going to go on a mission, and so you have a program of training that is nuanced and complicated, but right before departure, or right before they are to launch, you tell them, sort of, you underscore the basic instructions, like, don't forget XYZ. And we saw that with in Mulk, and we see this again with Al-Haqqah. But as we will see, Al-Haqqah is the language of Al-Haqqah itself. Although a short surah, and although at first look it appears to just underscore themes that were already addressed, but it does much more than that, and it engages the intellect and the psychology and the consciousness of the recipients of the surah. And so, not surprisingly, we find that Al-Haqqah does play it features in a lot of aspects of Islamic theology and the trajectory of Islamic thinking. So the first thing Al-Haqqah the study Quran translates it as the undeniable reality. Al-Haqqah, Mal-Haqqah, Ma Adraka Mal-Haqqah, so translates it as the undeniable reality. What is the undeniable reality? And what shall apprise thee of the undeniable reality? I am sure that a lot of translations will translate Al-Haqqah as, instead of undeniable reality, as some word connoting the hereafter. And this is part of what we will see is very fascinating about the surah. Al-Haqqah, on the one hand, it could be another word for the final day, the final judgment. We already know that the Quran names the final day. There are many words in the Quran that describe the final day. الواقعة, القارعة, يوم التناد, الطامة, الصاخة. All of these are words that connote the final day. And they are descriptive words. So, الطامة is a word that means the day of great affliction. As-Sakha, the day of great tribulations and hardship. Al-Waqi'ah, the day of great unfolding. Al-Qari'ah, the day of great turbulence. So, the hereafter, or the final day, which is the Quran underscores time and time again, is going to be a day of not just a transformative day, but it is a day that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala consistently and constantly invites us to live our lives in light of that, the inevitability of this unfolding future. You know, it's like if you are in school and I'm telling you consistently, you know, the day of graduation will come, and whether you like it or not, you're going to have to leave this school, and you will reach an age where you're going to have to move on. And this constant reminder that this is the day of the unfolding, which Allah wants us to take seriously, because it is a day of that will test us in every way. And so all these descriptive words that refer to the day of judgment are understandable. But then we come to Al-Haqqah, which is again at the one level simply a reference to the day of judgment. But on the other hand, in the same way that we say Al-Qari'ah is the day of great turbulence, because Qara'a means that, we come to Al-Haqqah, and here we have the day of judgment referred to with a word that embodies numerous subtleties and layers of meaning. So Al-Haqqah is derived from the word Haqq. And Haqq means what is right, your rights are, or the truth. So if you have a right to something, you have a haqq. And if you are speaking the truth, you are speaking haqq. And when Allah refers to that day as Al-Haqqah, there is a subtle grammatical point about the form, that it is not called the day of Haqq, but the day of Al-Haqqah. And when you use that form, the day of Al-Haqqah, instead of the day of Al-Haqq, the import of this is that this is the day in which things become due, or rights become due. So it is the day, as in Arabic, تحق فيه الحقوق، يحق فيه الحق، وتحق فيه الحقائق. So تحق فيه الحقائق is the day of the truth, where truth becomes clearly established. ويحق فيه الحق, the day in which not just in which, if you يحق فيه الحق, in which in many ways you could say the day in which justice becomes predominant, or that justice becomes absolute. وَتَحِقُّ فِيهِ الْحُقُوقِ is the day in which rights are vindicated. The phrase is in Arabic, just for the purposes of documentation. So for instance, you'll often read things like تَحِقُّ فِيهَا الْأُمُورِ أي تعرف على الحقيقة, or and in reference to the حقة أنها ذوات الحواق من الأمور أي الأمور الصادقة الواجبة الصدق. So what this means is, by the nature of the word itself, is the day, you could say the day of clarity, the day where the journey of the various shades of confusion, the various questions, the various puzzlements, the various whatever plagued us in life as lacking clarity and precision, that's the day of resolution. And Al-Haqqah, they say Al-Haqqah أخص من الحق, meaning that when you say haqq, that means truth, right, justice. But Al-Haqqah is more imperative, more pertinent, more pressing. So to say, for instance, if you say something is haqqati as opposed to haqqi, that is, when you call something haqqati instead of haqqi, a lot of modern Arabs don't know this, but I mean, we're not talking about modern Arabic, we're talking about classical Quranic Arabic. Haqqati is something that is undeniably yours. Not just your right, but imperatively and absolutely so. Also, when you say Al-Haqqah, it implies this is the day يحق كل محق في دين الله, which means this is the day in which every corruption, كل محق في دين الله means every corruption, will in Allah's religion, or in كل محق في العدل, or كل محق في دين الله, every obfuscation, every attempt to deform something, attempt to lie about something, attempt to corrupt something is addressed. Okay, so and we haven't, I mean, we could sit here and talk about what all the different connotations that are raised by Al-Haqqah for a while, because for instance, you could say, if you're talking to someone and you say حققته, means I've beaten. So when you say Yawm al-Haqqah, also means the day in which every arrogant, haughty, despotic tyrant will be beaten. So it's a remarkable expression, and it says Al-Haqqah, ma al-Haqqah wa ma adraka ma al-Haqqah. So the Haqqah, what is the Haqqah, and how would you know what is the Haqqah is? This raised a deeper question. When Allah says Al-Haqqah ma al-Haqqah wa ma adraka ma al-Haqqah, is Allah simply referring to what we see in Surah Al-Haqqah itself, called what the ayah number, hold on, 15, where Allah calls that day Al-Waqi'ah. Al-Waqi'ah means the day of the event. So is Allah, when Allah says Al-Haqqah, ma Al-Haqqah, ma adraka ma Al-Haqqah, is Allah simply referring to Al-Waqi'ah, or is the openings of Surah Al-Haqqah alerting us to something beyond that? Linguistically, if you're reading this surah without any context, you would say, well, there is nothing in the language itself that tells me that Al-Haqqah exclusively refers to the Day of Judgment. But Al-Haqqah could refer to the inevitability or the necessity of ihqaq al-haqq, the necessity of a process that ends in the upholding of haqa'iq, the upholding of truth or facts, the upholding of al-haqq, and the upholding of huquq, the upholding of rights. So you could, on the one hand, you'd say, yes, it's referring to the final day. It's referring to al-waqi'ah. It's referring to al-qari'ah. But on the other hand, linguistically, it could be referring to not simply it could have a normative connotation, and the normative connotation is that you must end up with ihqaq al-haqa'iq, ihqaq al-haqq, and ihqaq al-huquq. Al-haqa'iq, al-haqq, al-huquq. As we said, al-haqa'iq are the factual truth. Al-haqq is the truth, justice itself. And al-huquq are rights. So this is precisely why, I mean, you can find a lot written about this in the Islamic tradition, but the ones who, as we will see, did the most with it, were within the Sufi-esque orientation, where often they read as Al-Haqqah as a dual reference to the Day of Judgment, but often citing the hadith of Umar ibn al-Khattab, hold yourself to account before you are held to account. They say Al-Haqqah is in a similar vein. It is a reminder of the imperative of having a process within your life that ends in individual illumination and individual enlightenment. A day where falsehood dissolves. And as we will see, they go into much greater detail about this. But a day in which you are dissolving the lies, the falsehoods, the deceptions that you live plaguing your life with, or that plague your life throughout, that all stem from the corruption of the ego. And if the ego is corrupted, then your perceptions are corrupted. And if your perceptions are corrupted, then your consciousness is corrupted. And if the consciousness is corrupted, then of course the intellect doesn't work the way it should, and the heart doesn't respond the way it should. But in the similar vein, in my view, while the Sufi-esque tafsir clearly see Al-Haqqah وما أدراك ما الحاقة or Al-Haqqah ما الحاقة وما أدراك ما الحاقة as Al-Haqqah as a it carries the normative connotation of individual transformation and individual enlightenment. If you look at the language and the balance of the surah, as we will see, and you think of everything we said about that term, Al-Haqqah, that Al-Haqqah أخص من الحق, that Haqqah is more pressing than Haqq, than Al-Haqq, the word for truth or for what is right, or that Al-Haqqah is the Wat al-Hawaq, or that Al-Haqqah تحق الأمور, or that, so everything we said about Al-Haqqah, and you go back to linguistically, when you talk about Al-Haqqah, then you talk about إحقاق الحقائق, إحقاق الحق, وإحقاق الحقوق. Understanding it simply as either referring to the Day of Judgment or to an individual transformation and enlightenment, I think is narrowing the scope of the expression needlessly. Because if we're going to talk about the imperative of إحقاق الحقائق and إحقاق الحق and إحقاق الحقوق, then that's not accomplished simply at an individual level. If your context is corrupted, if your society is corrupted, regardless of the amount of enlightenment that you individually can accomplish, there is a cap. There is always a cap on how much you can achieve. Put it bluntly, regardless of how just you are as an individual, if you live in an unjust society, the inevitable result is that your justice is capped. You can only go thus far. And in fact, the thus far, the limit on how far you go, can often be entirely self-defeating. Because quite often, if the idea of Al-Haqqah وال-Haqqah إحقاق الحق وإحقاق الحقوق وإحقاق الحقائق, as we said, the center of that within the Sufi literature is to say to overcome selfishness. Right? Sufi literature focuses on you can't be a selfish human being. Selfishness defeats everything. But if I overcome my selfishness, what is it that is required of me Islamically? Okay, want for others what you would want for yourself. Okay, so I want for others what I want for myself. But if I live in an unjust society, I have severe limits on how I can help others. I have severe limits on what I can say or not say about the truth. I have severe limits on al-amr bil-ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar. I have severe limits on anything that can possibly clash not with institutions of power, but even individuals of power. So if a woman comes to me and says, you know, there is a powerful man who is sexually harassing me, I can't help her. In an unjust society, Islamically, I'm supposed to help her. But I can't. Because in an unjust society, I will be destroyed. If someone comes to me, as happens in unjust societies all the time, and says, you know, XYZ, this corrupt person has thrown me out of my house and, is persecuting me, and I'm always constrained. So the Sufi-esque approach of saying focus on yourself individually in the path of enlightenment, I understand it as a process towards something. But if it's not towards something, i.e. towards a just society, then by definition it is flawed and deformed. So what? You're an enlightened person, you understand everything, but you can't speak, you can't do. You effectively live in a prison. How is that Islamic? So, yes, understanding Al-Haqqah, Mal-Haqqah, wa ma adraka Mal-Haqqah. Sufis understood it as a call for individual liberation. And I respect that. But it is only getting us halfway. Traditional tafsir understood it as a simple reference to the hereafter. Wait till the hereafter. Sufi tafsir understood it as individual liberation. But both are flawed. Because it is not about individual liberation or just the hereafter. It is the call, the imperative of everything that has to do with إحقاق الحق, إحقاق الحقوق, and إحقاق الحقائق. These three, إحقاق الحقائق, إحقاق الحق, وإحقاق الحقوق. These three. And that is not possible unless we go beyond the individual to the social imperative of Al-Haqqah. So what is Al-Haqqah saying? Look at this, just 3 words, 3 ayat in very simple words. Where it says Al-Haqqah, Mal-Haqqah, Ma adraka Mal-Haqqah. As there's in the tradition, there's a story that it's been reported mostly as someone was what's his name, Al-Hajjaj. Al-Hajjaj was this governor in the Umayyad period who was a horrible tyrant and so on. So there's an imam who, Al-Hajjaj, anytime anyone would say anything critical of the Umayyad Khalifa, they would promptly be arrested and and tortured or killed or whatever. So every time Al-Hajjaj would pray in the Damascus mosque and this fellow would lead prayer, he would read Al-Haqqah. Eventually Al-Hajjaj got it. He understood, said, why is it that you read Al-Haqqah, Al-Haqqah, ma adraka ma Al-Haqqah? And the Imam said, because I love the surah. So Hajjaj said, read some other surah. the Imam again read Al-Haqqah. So the story goes is that he's arrested, and as he's tortured, he kept repeating again, Al-Haqqah, Al-Haqqah, ma adraka ma Al-Haqqah, Al-Haqqah, Al-Haqqah. That he was tortured to death. And he kept just repeating that. And it went down in history. Everyone understood that what this Imam was doing was saying, where are Al-Huquq? Where are Al-Haqa'iq? Where are the Haqq? Because when you say Al-Haqqah, it's like saying, it's like if I start out a poem by saying, what rights are due? Have you thought about what rights are due? Have you really thought about what rights are due? And yes, we can, as the traditional tafsir often do, say, well, God is talking about the hereafter. But till we get to the hereafter, are we supposed to simply postpone thinking about haqqa? Ma yahiq? Or ذوات al-hawaq, as they say. There is also, I couldn't find it where I read this, but in my notes on, when you write a book in academia, you end up taking far more notes than what ends up making it in the book. That always is the case, because you can't put everything. And so in the notes that I was taking on the rebellion book, one of the notes was a rebellion in the Abbasid era. The rebels, their rallying cry was simply one word, Al-Haqqah, Al-Haqqah. And what was meant by it is that we've been treated unjustly. So, but it was within the Arabic of the time, it was understood that if you're going to say Al-Haqqah, you're not talking about the final date, you're talking about the rights that are due to you. Anyway, but it didn't make it to the rebellion book, but it's in the notes. Okay. So, Al-Haqqah, ma Al-Haqqah, wa ma adraka ma Al-Haqqah. كذبت ثمود وعاد بالقارعة فأما ثمود فأهلكوا بالطاغية وأما عاد فأهلكوا بريح صرصر عاتية. Let's look at the translation first. Thamud and Ad denied Al-Qari'ah. The Study Quran translated it as calamity. And what is meant by a qari'ah or the calamity is the hereafter. As for Thamud, they were destroyed by, the Study Quran says, by the overwhelming, at-taghiyah. And as for Ad, they were destroyed by a howling, raging wind, بريح صرصر عاتية. Okay, so first we know that Thamud are the people of the Prophet Salih alayhi salam. and Ad are the people of the Prophet Hud alayhi salam. And Thamud, again, the language here is fascinating. It is often pointed out that Thamud were people of Ahl Ma' Qalil, people who their resources in water were limited. And we are told that they are destroyed by Taghiya. Ad, on the other hand, were people who had a lot of, and you remember that water in old societies was always a sign, and maybe even in our day, always a sign of wealth. The only exception to that is in the modern age when oil was discovered and changed the scales of things. But anyway, so Ad had an abundance of water. Thamud did not have an abundance of water. And we are told that Ad is destroyed by Rih Sarsarin Ati. In the traditional tafsir, you don't find a lot of variety in discussing this. They'll simply say what you would expect them to say, that Thamud were destroyed by a cataclysmic event that the Quran just calls a Taghiya in this context, and that Ad was destroyed by another cataclysmic event that the Quran describes or calls Rih Sarsarin Atiya in this context. But in tafsir or in commentaries on the Quran, not necessarily just Sufi-esque, but even within tafsir that could be described as more traditional, but deeper in outlook, like Al-Razi, for instance, or Tafsir al-Mataridi as well would fall in that same category. They pause at the word, at the expression Taghiya, that destroys Thamud, and let's first start with a Taghiya that destroys Thamud. A Taghiya is anything that is overwhelming because it goes to excess. So a Taghiya is anything that is overwhelming and that is also corrupting at the same time. So you find in a lot of the tafsir that they look at the fact that Thamud were people of modest resources. And if you remember, the test for Thamud is that although they had limited water resources, so water was extremely valuable to them, they were asked by God to share their water with a camel, a test which they ultimately failed, and they ultimately killed the camel. But a lot of commentaries say that when Allah, when the Quran says uhluku bit-taghiya, they were destroyed by taghiya, that what it is not just the cataclysmic event that ultimately destroys them, but that what precedes that cataclysmic event is that they suffered, in the language of a lot of the tafsir, is suffered under hujub al-jahl, that their selfishness, their greed, their lack of charitable character, ultimately made them a thoroughly ignorant people, and a people that were fundamentally had very little use for thought, for knowledge, for inquiry, and that lived from one darkness to another darkness. And instead of Allah saying, referring in Surah Al-Haqqah to the cataclysmic event, Allah chose a word like al-taghiya, which could mean a cataclysmic event, but could also mean a whole process of ignorance. When it came to Ad, the rih sarsar al-atiyah, rih al-sarsar al-atiyah is very cold wind. And with Ad, we are told that this cold wind, a noisy, cold wind, freezing, noisy wind, سخرها عليهم 7 ليال و8 أيام حسوما فترى القوم فيها صرعى كأنهم أعجاز نخل خاوية, that they were subjected to this wind for 7 nights and 8 days uninterrupted, so 7 nights and 8 mornings, until they all died and became like the trunks, the hollow trunks of palm trees. With Ad, their sins were of a different nature. Their sins were the sins of excess. They مغالون في الإباحية, so they were promiscuous. They had an excess of everything. They lived in an excess of luxury, and their excess of luxury in turn led them to an excess of zandaqa, meaning that they adopted more and more fantastical ideas about God. While the offense of Thamud was that they simply killed the camel and refused to share, the offense of Ad is how do I put it? Indulgence, overindulgence in material things, overindulgence in intellectual things, overindulgence in spiritual things, basically living, feeling entitled And the feeling of entitlement led them to take God for granted and start developing more and more fantastical ideas about God and who God is, and etc., etc. And as a result, they are destroyed through the very means of wind, which is normally thought of as a source of blessing, with an overabundance, an excess, which is normally thought of as a source of blessing, but it turns out to be the source of their destruction. Okay. So, do we understand this simply in the literal sense, or do we understand this allegorically? And especially in the Sufi-esque tradition, this part, the description about the destruction of Ad is understood both literally and allegorically. So the surah starts with Al-Haqqah, and they say Al-Haqqah is tajalli al-haqiqa al-ahadiyya, that it is the obvious truth that luxury and being spoiled, especially when it came to Ad, made them unable to see al-haqiqa, tajalli al-haqiqa al-ahadiyya, that unable to see the single obvious truth. And is there significance? They pause at Allah saying that they were exposed to it 7 nights and 8 days. And they say, why would Allah tell us that they were exposed to this loud, searing, cold wind for 7 nights and 8 days until they became like empty trunks, trunks of palm trees? And they understand this in the following allegorical way. They say that Allah is alerting us to 7 deadly sins, as deadly as the loud searing winds. The 7 are al-ghadab, al-shahwa, al-hiqd, al-hasad, al-bukhl, al-gubn, al-ajab. So these are al-ghadab, anger, inability to control your temper. Al-shahwa, being covetous. Shahwa is when, not anything that you consume in excess, whether food or sex. Normally it refers to sex, but it could include food as well. Al-Hiqd is spite, when you're constantly thinking of what others have. Spite, yeah, it's the best term. Al-Hasad is envy. Al-Bukhl is miserliness, stinginess. Al-Jubn is cowardliness. And Al-Ajab is, or Al-Ujub, that is arrogance, being haughty, fond of yourself. And these 7, and then they have a discussion about what the 8 days are, but I don't want to get into it because it will take us a long time. So these 7 would render a human being hollow from the inside, like a hollow tree trunk. So you exist physically, but spiritually you're dead. And they will often, they don't see it as coincidental that Allah begins with Al-Haqqah, Mal-Haqqah, Ma adraka Mal-Haqqah. And they don't see it as or rather, rephrase that. They see it as extremely significant that when it came to Thamud, Allah simply said that they were destroyed by a Taghiyah, meaning, hard-headedness and ignorance and selfishness of the type that is not very sophisticated. They just don't want to share. It's mine. And I don't have a lot to share, and water is rare anyway. And that type of lack of charity of character will destroy you, like a Taghiyah would destroy anyone. When it comes, however, to Ad, that the Rihan Sarsaran Atiyah is an allegory to the destructive impact of these seven: Al-Ghadab, Al-Shahwa, Al-Hiqd, Al-Hasad, Al-Bukhl, Al-Jubn, Wal-Ajab. That the anger, uncontrolled desire, spite, envy, miserliness, cowardliness, and arrogance. And that these sins leave the soul as if emptied in the body, as if the bark of a tree that has been hollowed and emptied. And so, if you have the sins of Ad, as in Sufi-esque literature often, but even I found this even in Ibn al-Qayyim, who's not a Sufi, obviously, but even Ibn al-Qayyim talks about the sins of Ad, that your ability not just to see Al-Haqqah as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but to see Al-Haqqah as the rights that are due to people, or to see the difference between Al-Haqq wa Ghayr Al-Haqq, or to see Al-Haqa'iq from Ghayr Al-Haqa'iq, it's a fool's errand. It's impossible. If you suffer from these moral defects, then so all paths to getting on the straight path is to work is to cleanse these defects within the self. And we'll see how this even is developed further in the surah, in this reading. فَهَلْ تَرَى لَهُم مِّن بَاقِيَةٍ. That rhetorical question where Allah asks the Meccans, or asks the Prophet ﷺ, do you see any remnants of these people? This is 8. Study Quran uses the same word. Remnants of these people. In Sufi-esque literature in particular, they take that rhetorical question and say, this is directed at you. Allah is saying, have you considered how these types of moral defects render people, leave people? I'm gonna go a little bit and then give you my take on all of this. Okay. وجاء فرعون ومن قبله والمؤتفكة بالخاطئة فعصوا رسول ربهم فأخذهم أخذة رابية لما طغى الماء حملناكم في الجارية لنجعلها لكم تذكرة وتعيها أذن واعية. Okay, so up to 17. So in 9, we have a specific reference to the Pharaoh. But وَجَاءَ فِرْعَوْنُ, but it doesn't just say the Pharaoh, but it says, and those before him. And وَالْمُؤْتَفِكَةُ بِالْخَاطِئَةِ. We pause at, again, these words, because al-mu'tafika, this is like subverted, and those subverted, and the study Quran says, and those subverted brought inequity. You could just read this and pass without paying attention. Why does it say, and those before? And why does it use that expression? وَالْمُؤْتَفِكَةُ. Mu'tafika is anything that brings falsehood and corruption. Literally, first we say that it is anything that brings falsehood and corruption. So, why wouldn't the Quran be more specific? Why would it simply talk about those who subvert and bring injustice and inequity? Again, when we read the Quran, we know that every word is used intentionally, that there are no just, haphazard usage. Then it says, فَعَصَوْا رَسُولَ رَبِّهِمْ فَأَخَذَهُمْ أَخْذَةً رَابِيَةً. It doesn't specify the Rasul, it just says they disobeyed Rasul, the Rasul of their God, and what was the consequence of that? They were taken by أخذة رابية. Rabia is, the study Quran says devastating blow, but أخذة رابية is not a devastating blow. It's when you uproot something because of its own weaknesses. So if I say Rab al-Ma, means the water has risen to the point that it is beyond control. Or if I say Rab al-Amr, or the same word riba comes from it. It's an excess. So when you say أخذة رابية, it means that they were destroyed by their own means. What destroyed them is themselves, or their own sins destroyed them. Then it says, إِنَّ لَمَّا طَغَى الْمَاءُ حَمَلْنَاكُمْ فِي الجَّارِيَةِ. So when there was, and we carried you when there was a flood. لِنَجْعَلَهَا لَكُمْ تَذْكِرَةً وَتَعِيَهَا أُذْنٌ وَاعِيَةٌ. Okay, so here it sounds like what the Quran is referring to is the flood of Noah, and that you survived the flood of Noah, and all of you are the descendants, at least all of you that came from the Near East, that area of the world, all of you are the descendants of those that were saved in Noah's ship. Okay, but it doesn't name the Prophet Nuh alayhi salam. And the language here sounds expansive and possibly ambiguous until we come to, in verse 12, so that attentive ears may take heed. So traditional tafsir approach first. Traditional tafsir say, okay, well, so Pharaoh and those before Pharaoh, they did a lot of falsehood, they disobeyed their prophets, so they were destroyed, and then there was the flood of Noah, and then after the flood of Noah, and basically learn from the Pharaoh and the flood of Noah. So traditional tafsir, it's the same again. But what the traditional tafsir don't answer is why the language is the way it is in Surah Al-Haqqah. We've already encountered the use of language and what appears to be the same themes, but the language renders different nuances of meaning in Surah Al-Mulk. And we see again in Surah Al-Haqqah the same dynamic. Beyond what I'm calling the traditional tafsir. So we take the tafsir that focused on the use of the specific language, and then we'll leave my gloss till the very end. So first, Pharaoh, in the same way that Ad is, first Thamud is understood with a special focus on what the nature of their sins were, and Ad was a special focus on the seven moral faults that leave a human being like a hollow body, a body without a moral conscience. Pharaoh is always understood as a symbol for the tyranny of the self. So especially in Sufi-esque tafsir, they always talk about Pharaoh al-Nafs. Pharaoh is universally, in Islamic theology, a symbol of tyranny. But especially in non-traditional tafsir that don't rely on naql, on just simply transmitted reports, they focus on al-mu'tafika or al-mu'tafikat, and the meaning of al-mu'tafikat and the meaning of al-khati'ah in this context. So Pharaoh, the symbol of tyranny, and every Pharaoh before Pharaoh, and as Ibn Arabi says, and every Pharaoh after Pharaoh. So every Pharaoh till the end of days. The presence of a Pharaoh individually or collectively leads to al-mu'tafika. And al-mu'tafika is, or al-mu'tafikat, هي القلوب المنكسة عن قبول الحق. That that type of tyranny of desire, that unrestrained ego, inflated ego of self-importance, what it does to the soul is that in direct proportion to the inflation of the ego is the diminution in the soul. The soul becomes broken and cowardly. But it is not just your soul that becomes broken and cowardly, but the soul of everyone around you that becomes broken and cowardly. The more you are a Pharaoh, the more your tyranny causes ittifaq for the souls of others. Ittifaq means they literally what is that expression? You shrink inside, because your ego is so big, there's no space. So the ego of others will either have to clash with you, and then it becomes a matter of who has more power to get their will through, or the ego of others has to shrink to give you space. And as the egos of others shrink to give you space, the khati'ah, meaning khati'ah is a consistent inability, a consistent and persistent inability to see the truth, or a failure to see the truth on a consistent and persistent basis. Because on the one hand you have an inflated ego, on the other hand you have shrunken egos, the dynamic is corrupted. So what can never be pursued in this is the truth. Although the Sufi-esque tafsir don't emphasize this, but I think it is obvious to emphasize this, that it is not just the failure to give yourselves its rights or others their rights on the basis of a family, but as the Quran clearly says, on the basis of society. If you have a Pharaoh in society, or you have a society plagued by pharaohs, so a society that doesn't have a way of restraining pharaohs. So a society in which if you're rich, you get your will. If you're wealthy, you call your terms. If you're rich, there's a process that applies to you that doesn't apply to others. What's going to happen to all those around you? Their egos will shrink, and they will become a mu'tafika. And if they become a mu'tafika, al-khati'ah is inevitable. At a social level, justice becomes impossible to achieve. The most concrete effect of this is hypocrisy. Pharaohs breed nifaq. Pharaohs breed hypocrisy. The existence of a pharaoh means the existence of hypocrisy. No one can be truthful in the presence of a pharaoh, because truth hurts. It's very dangerous. So you learn to speak in double languages and triple languages. You learn to smile when you want to frown. You frown when you want to smile. Language doesn't mean what it means. Everything is geared to appease the Pharaoh. Now, so when as and notice here I'm just skipping 10 for now. إِنَّا لَمَّا طَغَى الْمَاءُ حَمَلْنَاكُمْ فِي الجارية. So this is in traditional tafsir understood as a reference to the Prophet Nuh alayhi salam. But in Sufi-esque tafsirs especially, it's understood as طغيان ماء حب الدنيا والإغراق في حب الهوى. That it is the flood that it speaks about is that the flood of losing perspective about this world and falling in love with material things and being in love with your own whims. And when Allah says حَمَلْنَاكُمْ فِي الجارية in Sufi tafsir, they often understand سفينة النجاة, that the salvation, the ship that has the promise of saving people in this flood. In Sufi tafsir, they're often referred to it as a Sharia, but what they mean by Sharia here is not the technical laws of Sharia, but the moral, ethical laws of Sharia. That it is that the gift that Allah provides that still holds hope for people. If you are plagued by the sins of Ad, and if you're plagued by the sins of Pharaoh, and that if these sins have made you lose all moral perspective and become overcome by the flood, there is only one hope for you, and that is to reattach yourself to Sharia, meaning the ethical path of Allah. And you'll see why all of this even becomes even more and more important. Okay. Now, فَعَصَوْا, this is verse 10. فَعَصَوْا رَسُولَ رَبِّهِمْ فَأَخَذَهُمْ أَخْذَةً رَابِيَةً. So, what is the Rasul? They disobeyed. They disobeyed the Rasul, and as a result, they were overcome by their own sins. In traditional tafsir, they say, well, this is a clear reference to disobeying the Prophet Musa alayhi salam, or a reference to the Prophet Nuh alayhi salam. They disobeyed the Prophet. In Sufi tafsir, they say, no, the reason Allah doesn't name a prophet is Allah wants you to entertain a deeper possibility. And the deeper possibility is the Rasul that has been disobeyed here is Al-Aql Al-Hadi ila Al-Haqqah. That Al-Aql Al-Hadi ila Al-Haqqah translates as the intellect that guides you towards the truth. But here they don't mean philosophical intellect. They mean Aql al-Hikmah, if you will, spiritual intellect, or the intellect leading to wisdom, meaning the inner reason, inner source of reason within you, that tells you that being a pharaoh is wrong, hypocrisy is wrong, and mu'tafika, the type of deceptions and lies that result from living with a pharaoh or being a pharaoh is wrong. That is the inner Rasul that is disobeyed and that ultimately leads to Arabia. So let's take a step back again. Why do the traditional tafsir understand it this way? Why do the Sufi-esque tafsir understand it this way? The Sufi-esque tafsir, Allah says, Allah in Surah Al-Haqqah uses language that is intentionally leaves open the possibilities of meaning. In traditional tafsir, they say, well, we sort of understand what it's referring to. In Sufi-esque tafsir, they say, no, if Allah, elsewhere, when Allah wanted to say Nuh, He said Nuh. When Allah wanted to say the Pharaoh, or, wanted to say things very specifically, said so. But here in Surah Al-Haqqah, and of course, I tend to agree with the Sufi-esque tafsir, but I take it beyond where the Sufi-esque tafsir take it. Meaning that in Surah Al-Haqqah, if you understand it, especially at the time of revelation, and especially that it comes after Surah Al-Mulk, and considering the themes of Surah Al-Mulk, and the themes of all the surah that have been revealed, leading up to the Isra and right after the Isra, Surah Al-Haqqah is delivering nothing short of what the big title of Surah Al-Haqqah is, which is Al-Haqqah. What is due? The haqa'iq, the huquq, and Al-Haqq. So the truth and justice and rights. And if it's going to address these issues, the language that it talks about what appears to be common themes as the Sufis understand it, they're absolutely right. It is expansive and it is language that opens possibilities of interpretation, and a deeper moral insight would understand why this language is there, but it cannot stop at the level of individual enlightenment. Surah Al-Haqqah is clearly talking about not just the individual, but beyond the individual. What it would be that Al-Haqq and Al-Huquq and Al-Haqa'iq, for these three to be, requires a social dynamic and not just an individual dynamic.
So, told لنجعلها لكم تذكرة وتعيها أذن واعية. Study Quran so that we might make it a reminder for you and that attentive ears might take heed. And ونجعلها لكم تذكرة, we encounter the usage of dhikra or tazkira or dhakirin in the Quran quite often, referring to either the Quran itself as dhikra or to belief, or the necessity of belief as tazkira, as a reminder. What's unusual or different in Surah Al-Haqqah is وَتَعْيَهَا أُذْنٌ وَعْيَةٌ. The reference to أُذْنٌ وَعْيَةٌ, attentive ears. Why attentive ears? And what does that mean to say وَتَعْيَهَا أُذْنٌ وَعْيَةٌ? Of course, as you would probably expect, that traditional tafsir don't pause at this very long
they will often note that a hadith reported from the Prophet ﷺ that the Prophet tells Imam Ali radiallahu anh that سألت الله أن يجعلها أذنك علي, that in reference to al-udhun al-wa'iya, that the Prophet ﷺ tells Ali, I pray to Allah that this would be your ears, Ali, and that Ali ibn Khattab, Ali ibn Abi Talib responds or comments on this by saying, فَمَا سَمِعْتُ مِنَ الرَّسُولِ شَيْئًا وَنَسِيتُهُ قَطْ, that since the Prophet made this dua, whatever I heard from the Prophet ﷺ, I never forgot. And so in the implication, at least in traditional tafsir, that udhun wa'iya is equal to an attentive person and equal to a good memory. But there isn't much elaboration. What you find in more either Sufi-esque tafsir that often comment that udhun wa'iya is udhun al-fitra, is the ears of innate instinct within a person. That's one trend that you find often in Sufi-esque literature. But in more rationalistic tafsir, like al-Razi or Zamakhshari, they will say that al-udhun al-wa'iya هي وعي يحفظ العلم وأذن من شأنها أن تحفظ ما يجب حفظه بالتذكرة والتفكر فيه ولا تضيعه بترك العمل. What this means is that الأذن الواعية is one, careful listening, that you know human beings don't listen to everything carefully. So it's conscientious, careful listening. Then beyond careful listening is the effort to remember what you've heard and reflecting upon what you've heard, and then what you've learned translates into action. لا تضيعه بترك العمل means that it must necessarily translate into action. And in this context, they often refer to a hadith attributed to the Prophet ﷺ, لا خير في العيش إلا لعالم ناطق ومستمع واع, which roughly would translate as, for meaningful life or meaningful living is in a scholar who speaks and conscientious listeners who listen. So you need the duality of good scholars and good listeners. And so that hadith obviously bolsters the spirit. So, but we go back and say, notice that udhun wa'iya here is used before, like to close off a section or to complete a section in the Surah Al-Haqqah. So it starts out with Al-Haqqah, rights that are due, accountability, the necessity of accountability, the necessity of Al-Huquq, Al-Haqq, and Al-Haqqa'iq, the necessity of rights, truth, and justice, and takes you into the people who are overcome by taghiyah, by injustice, tyranny against the self. It takes you to the people who were corrupted by excess, and their destruction was, whether the Sufis are right that the 7 sins, but their destruction by the methods of their own excess is at least what we can all agree upon. And then it takes you to the Pharaoh, the epitome of tyranny, and the type of deception and corruption that is caused by the type of tyranny in al-mu'tafikat al-khati'ah, hypocrisy and lies, and even mu'tafikat khati'ah could even be deception and backstabbing, could fit within al-mu'tafikat al-khati'ah. And also Rasul, whether the Rasul is the revealed message of the messenger, the revelation, or the inner Rasul within that conscience that God placed in all of us that tells us, you know, so many of us will convince ourselves that tyranny is okay, that injustice is tolerable, that arrogance is sustainable, that selfishness is okay. But innate in our conscience, something that you find even in the pure conscience of a child, or even in the way that dogs or animals react to injustice, that tells you that innately we know that all these are wrong. But it is not, it is no coincidence that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then comes and flags to us uzunun wa'iyah. It's exactly as the Prophet ﷺ said. You could have the best scholars in the world, and these scholars could spell out all, you know, perfect theories of everything and say all the wonderful, but if you don't have conscientious listeners that reflect upon what they hear and that translate what they hear into action, the equation falls apart. Then there is no haqqah. Then the whole dynamic of speaking about al-haqqah becomes nonsense. Okay. So then Surah Al-Haqqah transitions to فَإِذَا نُفِخَ فِي الصُّورِ نَفْخَةً وَاحِدَةً. So now the blow, as they study Quran, says the single blast is blown in the trumpet. So the trumpet of the end. فَيَوْمَئِذٍ وَقَعَتِ الْوَقَعَ. Now we have the final day. وَانشَقَّتِ السَّمَاء فَهِيَ يَوْمَئِذٍ وَاهِيَةٌ. Translation first, 16, the sky shall be rent asunder, for that day it shall be frail. That's very literal. Okay. If you were not a believer, I feel that this one ayah could make you a believer. Because what it's saying is, this sky right now, it appears solidly put together. Did I write that quote? That this sky is في صورة محكمة, that it is tight, it is meticulous, it is well measured, and it sustains life. But then with the end, فإذا هي واهية أي مسترخية, meaning that the tight measurements that sustain the sky will be undone. It's like literally you come and you cut off the threads, or you undo the threads, and then the nature of that sky, of the heavens that surround you, will be something that we don't recognize, but it is necessarily connotes turbulence. To describe it that way, it's only the one who has made it so tight, so well measured in the first place, who would be able to know how the sky would look when it is not so tightly measured. Would be. It is a remarkable expression. فإذا فهي واهية. It is not the medieval image of the sky falling upon the earth, which was but literally Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who knows that how exceptional it is to have a sky that envelopes the earth and that sustains life in it, and what it means for that to be undone. Okay. والملك على أرجائها ويحمل عرش ربك فوقهم يومئذ ثمانية. Study Quran says, and the angel shall be at its sides, and that day 8 shall carry the throne of thy Lord above them. Okay, now, so وَالْمَلِكُ عَلَى أَرْجَائِهَا. So there are angels that will be, whatever the image, that the angels that will be standing on the sides. But the throne carried by 8. And Imam al-Hasan says, in what became a statement that influenced a lot of tafsir, says لا أدري 8 أشخاص أو 8,000 أو 8 صفوف أو 8,000 صف. Allah doesn't tell us 8 what? 8 angels, 8,000, 8 lines of angels, or even whether angels or not, or 8,000 صف, 8,000 lines of possibly. So 8 carrying the arsh. Now, in old times, there occurred a debate in that the Mushabbiha, a theological sect in Islam, said this means that Allah will come upon a throne, and that throne is carried by 8. And as we said, we don't know what the 8 are, but whatever. But this poses a problem in Islam. In the Bible, this type of imagery, especially in the Old Testament, is not unusual. But in Islam, the idea that God would be carried upon a throne is seriously problematic. Although I've heard modern Muslims in doing tafsir Surah Al-Haqqah, I've heard it in an Islamic center where a guy just said it, oh yeah, God is going to be carried on a throne of 8 angels, which is me. So here's a quote from Al-Razi. I'll read it in Arabic first and I'll paraphrase it. وقال لا يمكن أن يكون المراد منه أن الله جالس في العرش، وذلك لأن كل من كان حاملا للعرش كان حاملا لكل ما كان في العرش، فلو كان الإله في العرش للزم للملائكة أن يكونوا حاملين لله تعالى، وذلك محال لأنه يقتضي احتياج الله إليهم، وأن يكونوا أعظم قدرة من الله تعالى، كل ذلك كفر صريح. فعلمنا أنه لابد فيه من التأويل، فنقول السبب في هذا الكلام هو أنه تعالى خاطبهم بما يتعارفونه، فخلق لنفسه بيانا يزورونه وليس أنه يسكنه. then he gives an example. فمثلا قال الله تعالى أنه جعل الله تعالى في ركن البيت حجرا وهو يمينه في الأرض، إذ كان من شأنه أن يعظموا رؤساءهم بتقبيل أيمانهم، وجعل على العباد حفظة، ليس لأن النسيان يجوز عليه سبحانه، ولكن هذا هو المتعارف. فكذلك لما كان من شأن الملك الملك إذا أراد محاسبة عماله جلس إليهم على سرير ووقف الأعوان حوله، أحضر الله يوم القيامة عرشا وحضرت الملائكة وحفت به، لا لأنه يقعد عليه أو يحتاج إليه، بل لمثل ما قلناه في البيت والطواف. So what he's saying is actually something if only modern Muslims would understand, it would have some good impact on them. Is that Allah, for instance, made the Kaaba and said, circumambulate around the Kaaba, and made a hajar, a rock, in the side of the Kaaba on the right side. And that in another part that I didn't read, where it says, and people kiss the rock. All of this is not because Allah is present in the Kaaba, or not because kissing the rock means anything, but it is for Allah to introduce symbolisms that human beings can relate to. Because in the same way that kings present rings and people kiss the ring of the king as a sign of humility, Allah presented to human beings things that they can relate to and understand. So he's saying that if it was the case that there are angels carrying the throne and Allah is sitting upon the throne, this is a huge problem, because it would mean that these angels are strong enough, or perhaps even stronger than Allah, so that they can carry Allah. And it would mean that Allah needs to be seated on a throne and be carried forward, which is all kufr sarih, which is all just simple kufr. You can't say things like that, in Islam at least. And so if it is not possible that we say that Allah can be limited to a throne, and that Allah would sit in a throne, and that Allah would be carried forward in a throne, then what is the purpose of this? And what he's saying, and what that school of thought says, is that all of this is language that tries to relate to the human intellect by what they would relate to. And the human intellect relates to power in terms of thrones, and thrones being carried forward. And so that's what Allah uses to present a picture. But to take that picture literally would completely miss the point. Um, and even in this school of thought, even they say that. So I mean, another part that I didn't read is that we talk about that the throne. When God talks about a throne, it in the same way that when God talks about a hand, the divine hand, or that it has nothing to do with the human hand. That when Allah talks about a throne, it has nothing to do with any throne that we know. To imagine it as like a throne that we understand kings to be seated on is heretical. That Allah doesn't sit on the throne and so on. Okay. So يومئذ تعرضون لا تخفى منكم خافية فأما من أوتي كتابه بيمينه فيقول هؤم اقرأوا كتابي إني ظننت أني ملاق حسابي فهو في عيشة راضية في جنة عالية قطوفها دانية كلوا واشربوا هنيئا بما أسلفتم في الأيام الخالية وأما من أوتي كتابه بشماله فيقول يا ليتني لم أوتي كتابي ولم أدري ما حسابي يا ليتها كانت القاضية ما أغنى عني مالية هلك عني سلطانية. Okay, so this will take us to 29. So that day you will be presented before your Lord, and nothing لا تخفى خافية, nothing will be concealed. لا تخفى منكم خافية, nothing is concealed, nothing is hidden. We've encountered this before. The kitab in the yamin, the book in the right hand, or the book or in the right, and the book on the left, we've encountered this before, and although traditional tafsir say the right hand means the right hand and the left hand means the left hand, as we encountered before, that this is understood idiomatically. When you say biyamin al-shay means that it's good news. Yasar al-shay or shimal al-shay means it's bad news. Now, so I remember, some left-handed kid would say, but I'm left-handed, well, if you're left-handed, I wouldn't be surprised if you get your book in your left hand. But biyamin, it doesn't mean that literal thing. It doesn't mean you're going to get it in your right hand or left hand. Means whether it's a good news or bad news. That's the point. Okay. So, and you notice at 23 and 24, we encountered this before, that in the traditional tafsir they understand that qutufuha daniya, that it's a reference to fruits being hanging low and you are able to pick the fruits without effort, while in Sufi-esque tafsir they understand all of this as allegorical. And especially in Surah Al-Haqqah, where it says qutufuha daniya, it doesn't say fruit. It just says its pickings are low. So, as in 23 in the study Quran, it says low-hanging clusters. Its pickings are low. So, in Sufi tafsir, it is always what you drink. You drink the water of knowledge, and what you pick are the pickings of enlightenment according to who you were in your life on earth. So even those who make it to heaven, the extent to which they are enlightened in the hereafter depends on what they've done, what station they achieved, and what they aspire for. Okay. Now, as to those who receive the bad news, obviously, the most immediate reaction is like when you get a really bad report card, is, I wish I never got it. When it's horrible news and you're confronted by all the zift you've done in life, and of course, you wish that there was no resurrection. You wish that you would have stayed dead. But ما أغنى عني مالية هلك عني سلطانية. So the هلك عني سلطانية is very important, especially in Surah Al-Haqqah, but it's important in Quranic imagery generally. As-Sultan is your power, and whatever allowed you to feel powerful. And the first thing you notice in the hereafter is the truth about yourself, and that is how truly disempowered you are. It is, especially in Sufi-esque literature, it's said that nothing will terrify the pharaohs of the world as much as the absolute loss. Imagine if someone is going to go to a maximum security prison, they control nothing in the affairs of their life. They don't control when they wake up, when they sleep, when they take a shower, when they eat. So it is, but with no hope for the foreseeable future. And anyway, the span of time, it is said in the hereafter that span of time is far exceeds anything we've known on earth. So despair is very real. Next we get to خذوه فغلوه ثم الجحيم صلوه ثم في سلسلة ذراعها 70 ذراعا فاسلكوه. This is the translation first. Where am I? Okay. Take him and shackle him, then cast him in hellfire, then put him in chains whose length is 70 cubits. The important thing to say about 70 ziran, 70 cubits, is that traditional tafsir do exactly as the study Quran did. They say 70 feet or 70 cubits or 70 arms length chain. And in some traditional tafsir, you'll find them citing a hadith that's not authentic, which I was in a mosque once where a guy was doing tafsir of Surah Al-Haqqah for a youth group, and he cited this hadith to that youth group, that the chain will enter from the mouth and exit from the anus. And in some versions of the hadith, it's the opposite. Enter from the anus and exit from the mouth. And of course, you can, although I was quite young, I told the guy that this was not an authentic hadith, and he told me it's authentic, but he was wrong. Anyway, I wonder what the effect of that upon the youth group was. But the important thing is that in a lot, I'm not even going to say Sufi-esque tafsir, because you find it in many elsewhere. So ليس الغرض التقدير بهذا المقدار بل الوصف بالطول. So number one is that the expression 70, it is not in Arabic of the time. It's like when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells the Prophet, even if you ask Allah to forgive them 70 times, Allah will not forgive them. It's not the 70, that expression didn't mean the number 70, counting 70. It meant a lot of times. So it's the same one that when Allah, even if you ask Allah to forgive them 70 times, Allah will not forgive them, meaning a lot of times. And so when it says sab'ina dhira, it means that it is a very long chain. So that's one thing. The other thing is, what is this chain? And here in Sufi-esque tafsirs especially, but also in others like Razi, they say that, relying on several things, say that the chain is not just any chain. The idea is not just a chain, meaning just any chain, but a chain of الأخلاق السيئة والأوصاف الرديئة والطبيعة الظلمانية. فهي كلها سلاسل عذاب يوم القيامة وأغلال وطرد وحجاب. So that it is your own ill manners and bad characteristics and darkness of the soul becomes the chain that is wrapped around you. You are chained by your own darkness. And that these chains, in the Sufi-esque literature particularly, they focus on how these chains prevent you from exposure to the divine, so that you don't see the divine, you're not near the divine, and that these chains, it's like saying literally your sins will be the rope that goes around your neck. It's sort of like, there is a story, I don't know if it's true or not, but I've heard it when I was very young in a halaqah once, and then I know that it's been around, told about that chain, that it's supposed to take place in Maghreb, in Morocco, that an imam was reading Surah Al-Haqqah, and there was a young man who was in prayer. You're a young man who's trying to become religious, and then he got to that sab'una zira ayah, the ayah about the 70 chain of 70 feet long or whatever, and that young man, upon hearing the ayah, fainted, and they had to carry him home. That's one version of the story, is that he fainted and they carried him home, and it just became that's where the story ends. There's another version to the story which says that the man was carried home, and then his mother said, why did my son faint, and what did you do to my son? And the Imam said, I didn't do anything to your son, I was just reading Surah Al-Haqqah, and I got to this part and he fainted. And the mother told him, what part? And so the Imam recited Surah Al-Haqqah to her again. And upon hearing that same part of Surah Al-Haqqah again, the man heard it again, this time in his mother's house. This time he didn't faint, he had a heart attack and died. And then when the mother saw that her son died, she died. She had a heart attack and died. And so Surah Al-Haqqah killed the mother and the child. That is it. That's the story. What is the point? I don't know, but that's what it just stuck with me. That's what I was told. Version 1 or version 2. So, I've always, and so of course, having heard it when I was fairly young, I always would come to Sabona Zara, and I would say, why am I not fainting? It must be that I'm a horrible human being because I'm not fainting. So, I don't know. Allahu Alam if it's true or not, or if there is some truth to it. Oh, okay. All right. So, now, Surah Al-Haqqah comes to justify when it underscores those who received their accountability with the left, meaning doom, and those who are wrapped in the chain. Two things are emphasized. إِنَّهُ كَانَ لَا يُؤْمِنُ بِاللَّهِ الْعَظِيمِ, didn't believe in God. Second, وَلَا يَحُضُّ عَلَى طَعَامِ الْمِسْكِينِ, and did not feed the poor, but did not urge the feeding of the poor, did not call for the feeding of the poor. Now, of course, in a lot of traditional tafsir is just noted, but in more moralistic orientations, you pause. And in my view, the fact that this is in Surah Al-Haqqah, after Surah Al-Mulk, after Al-Isra, before the Hijrah, when, as we said before, Allah is underscoring the most critical and important elements. It is no small matter that after talking to you about Ad and Thamud and Pharaoh and taking you through this journey, Allah underscores two things: disbelief and attitudes towards the poor. So it's one thing if you don't feed the poor, but it's another when you don't even recognize it as an imperative. How about those who speak against feeding the poor? And it's not just the feeding the poor, but it's taking care of the poor. How about those who, in our modern language, are the so-called conservatives of society that think the poor should fend for themselves, or that society doesn't owe the poor anything? Or how about those who spend on luxury items knowing that there are people in need, including, of course, displaced human beings and refugees all around the world? It's very problematic. But we'll come back to this point at the end. Okay. And the fate, emphasizing the fate of punishment, takes us to 37. Then notice the qasam of 38 and 39. فلا أقسم بما تبصرون وما لا تبصرون. Allah swears بما تبصرون is the material world. وَمَا لَا تُبْصِرُونَ is everything beyond the material world. It is, and put bluntly, if your consciousness is limited to the material world, then your ability to understand إِنَّهُ لَقَوْلُ رَسُولٍ كَرِيمٍ, and this is the divine revelation of a sent prophet, and the message of Al-Haqqah itself, it will be deeply flawed. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells not the Prophet, but tells Muslims and non-Muslims that if this Prophet تقول علينا بعض الأقاويل لأخذنا منه باليمين ثم لقطعنا منه الوتين. This is 44, 45, 46. We'd have taken him, and I'll comment on this, by the right hand, then we would have severed his life vein. This is again an idiomatic expression. لأخذنا منه باليمين means we would have grabbed him. ولقطعنا منه الوتين, and exterminated his life with prejudice. فَمَا مِنْكُمْ مِنْ أَحَدٍ عَنْهُ حَاجِزِينَ, and none of you would have been able to help him. This poses a question of why would Allah say this? Now, normally when we find something like this in the Quran, we find an occasion for revelation, some incident that happened. But in Surah Al-Haqqah, there is no occasion of revelation, no asbab nuzul revealed or reported, but simply the statement that underscores that not even your prophet, not even this prophet, not even the man that you follow has the authority to change what God is telling you. And I'll explain this in a second. Just bear with me. And we know أن وإنا لنعلم أن منكم مكذبين, that we know that the fact of life are the disbelievers, the unreachables, which we've encountered the Quran time and time again telling us, reminding of this. وَإِنَّهُ لَحَقُّ الْيَقِينِ, but this is the truth. فَسَبِّحْ بِاسْمِ رَبِّكَ الْعَظِيمِ. So the conclusion is to uphold the singular, I don't want to say, it's not greatness, but the singular magnificence or sovereignty of God. Okay, so it starts out with Al-Haqqah, accountability, and accountability always means justice. And we said Al-Haqqah is Al-Haqq, Al-Haqa'iq, Al-Huquq. And it takes us to those who sinned was miserliness. The people of Saleh, who didn't have a lot, but they were greedy. They didn't want to share. And it takes us to the people of Hud, the people whose sin is excess and corruption and luxury. And takes us to the people, to the Pharaoh, whose sin is tyranny. The result of all these three is the loss of the very dynamic that would lead to Al-Haqqah. Al-Haqqah either on this earth or in the hereafter. The Sufis say the loss of Al-Haqqah individually, but there's no reason to limit it to the individual. But we must understand it beyond the individual. It is either Al-Haqqah in this earth or in the hereafter. Now, but to understand that if you approach Allah the way you approach human logic, if you think of God in human terms, and so you think that God, the way I understand this, includes that you think of God in terms of God as a, the president, like a king of a kingdom who cares about who raises the flag, or who cares about optics, or who cares about technicalities, or rather than substantive morality and substantive ethics. You're going to go astray. And ultimately, you'll end up shackled in your own sins. What will shackle you is your own darkness, and you will never approach the truth of your Lord. You must understand truly what God's greatness, Allah al-Azim, means. But you know what? You will never go anywhere unless you learn to take care of those amongst you that are weak, those who are needy. To claim that you have an understanding of God's greatness, and this is of course consistent with all the numerous hadiths where the Prophet ﷺ says that you don't serve God unless you serve God's people. Yeah, unless you're kind to human beings, then forget about your whole claim of piety. But you Muslims who are about to embark on this next very important step, understand you are not about the charismatic rule of your prophet. As the Quran will tell Muslims elsewhere, in fact, even if the prophet dies, it doesn't take you off the hook. Yeah, it says, is it that if the prophet dies, you're going to change? Here, not even the prophet can change what God has decreed. Your prophet himself, the importance of this is that Muslims cannot be about a charismatic ruler or leader. You are not about the charisma of this man. You are about the principles that this man is teaching. And regardless of what stage in life you will be in, remember,
something that Allah has reminded Muslims of consistently and persistently. There will always be people who will refuse to believe. Just because there are people who will defy you and say, no, it doesn't mean anything in terms of how self-secure you should be about your own path. And this is the truth, but it is all anchored on فَسَبِّحْ بِاسْمِ رَبِّكَ الْعَظِيمِ. The greatness, the majesty, the singular magnificence of your Lord. It is not an exaggeration to say that the path for every enlightenment and the path for all morality and the path for understanding إحقاق الحق and Al-Haqqah starts with فَسَبِّحْ بِاسْمِ رَبِّكَ الْعَظِيمِ. This is precisely why when you find, I don't care who they are, I don't care what turban they wear, I don't care what their, insignia of religiosity they have on, I don't care what degrees they've earned, I don't care what they claim about their piety. If they are unable, or they seem to be unable to see إحقاق الحق, upholding justice and right, giving what is due to people their due, I don't believe that they have an understanding of فَسَبِّحْ بِاسْمِ رَبِّكَ الْعَظِيمِ. Because there are a lot of Sufis around, there are a lot of Salafis around, there are a lot of Wahhabis around, there are a lot of Mullahs around, there are a lot of Shuyukh around, there are a lot of Ayatollahs around that claim that they're all about Tasbihullah and worship and ibadah and so on. But if they don't understand what Ihqaq al-Haqq is about, then they must have been worshipping something, but it's not Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's Surah Al-Haqqah. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alamin.
So, Assalamu alaikum, we're back. Oh. Okay, no, you know what? I feel bad. I'm just going to wear mine so you can take it off the whole time.
No.
Okay. Wait. Let me do my little thank you, because that was an amazing surah. And it's so, honestly, God bless the people on Interactive Group, because you really don't feel like just the power of being here in person until you've actually had to do it on the Interactive Group. So that just, all of you guys who show up time and time again, it's, God bless you, because it's a big effort to do it. And inshallah, I hope one day you can come in person and experience it, because it's truly different. And it's, so inshallah. You're earning massive hasanat. And also on YouTube, people who show up, time and time out. So God bless you.
It's the presence of the angels that whenever you have a halaqah like this, there are angels.
Yeah, you feel them. You feel them for sure. So anyway, this was, what can you say? Every single surah is just incredible, and we're so blessed to just always have you say, okay, well, here's the traditional, here's the Sufi-esque, and now here's my take, which is just, I can't wait for hearing your take, because I feel like it's just such a richer, more intuitive, take on things. You feel it in your heart, and that's, to me, what makes it really ring true. And then especially when you just, and at this point, and now we've heard a lot of these messages, again and again, and have had the time to, see it in play in life. And so when you hear it again, I think it really cements the idea of power, and just the importance of thinking about helping people who are oppressed or in poverty, and just the importance of these messages. And so anyway, alhamdulillah, it's so beautiful. And even I love it when you bring it to the example, when a when you're in training and you go through the whole process, but then at the end it's like, okay, remember this and remember this and remember this. You know, like then you really feel like how these surahs played a role in their time. And so those things are so valuable when we understand them in our language and our time. So thank you, alhamdulillah. So does anyone have any questions to start us off? Okay, Sharif. I'll just leave my mask on now, so I can take off. Oops, sorry.
My question's about hell. Because
you want to know what it's like before you go?
Oh my God.
so hell is described in the in the last halaqah or the halaqah before that, we described it as multiple times you've talked about it as the Quran talks about it, as if it's a living and breathing entity. Which when we were going through the verses today, and also whether authentic or not interpretations that are extremely disturbing of hell, I thought of this, even though it doesn't refer to hell in this surah as a living and breathing entity in that way. And so if God doesn't create evil, and if evil is the absence of God, then how do we reconcile that with hell being a creation? Because I mean, it seems like the absence of something wouldn't be living and breathing as if it's an entity. And what I'm thinking is that it seems like hell is not necessarily evil in and of itself, but it's actually a manifestation of justice for evil people. Mm-hmm. It's a necessary requirement for the balance of and for justice to be a reality. And so when we're going through the Quran, I guess my question is that when we're going through the Quran and we're encountering these verses on hell, especially for those who are not who are new to this and might have a difficult time with the descriptions of punishment, is that like the universal that Allah is compassionate? So if the ends is not a compassionate ends, then there's something wrong with how we arrive there. Is it that when we're thinking of hell, it should not be looked at in the terms of it being something that is evil, but is always within the lens of understanding justice in the universal term, both in this life and the hereafter?
Can you just repeat? I mean, that's, yeah.
I don't know how to paraphrase that. I guess the question is, well, it's not really a question, but you know, if I is hell evil? And I guess if I would turn that into question, I would say, well, you know, how do we understand the hell in relation to the notion of God and the existence of evil, and especially in relation to God's compassion and mercy. First, there is nothing that would lead us to the belief that hell is evil. You know, God created, and from the Islamic perspective, earth is living, the sun is living, the moon is living, everything is living. We don't understand their life because it's different than our own life, and we don't understand their tasbih because it's different than our own tasbih. And this is precisely, subhanAllah, I mean, especially philosophers and Sufis, when they talk about their desire for enlightenment, their passion for understanding these things eventually. Okay, Ibn Arabi has these amazing passages in his Futuhat about wanting to understand the way that every living thing is living. And so he wants to understand everything from an animal to a plant to a mountain to the moon. How is it living? And he considers that part of heaven, the part of the reward that Allah would allow a person. But anyway, so that's one. If hell is living, then it's living in the same way that earth is living, or a mountain is living, or we don't have the vocabulary or the consciousness to understand in what way is it living. That's the other thing, is that there is no source or no reason to believe that hell is evil. In the same way that the concept of a prison in and of itself is not evil. I mean, it might be that people inside of a prison do evil things, but the very existence of a thing is defined by its purpose and its function, and when it is part of the instrumentalities of justice, it is not evil. It serves a critical purpose, the absence of which would possibly constitute evil. If there is no hell, then we'd have a serious problem with God's justice. And the irony is that, in my view, if there is no hell, then we have a serious problem with God's mercy and God's compassion as well. Because what does it mean for there to be a compassionate or a merciful God that equates between evildoers and those who do good? Now, God is merciful in the sense that justice is merciful. You know, it is not blind justice. It is not oblivious justice. It is justice with equity. So, you know, in earthly justice often lacks equity, meaning that it has rules of procedure, and if you stick to the rules of procedure, you win, or if you stick to if you stick to the game, you win. But God's justice is not about winning. It's about substantive justice, equitable justice. Now, of course, that has led many Muslim theologians to say that all those who go to hell have a bill to pay. And once they pay their bill, and there are even a lot of schools that believe that eventually hell will be completely empty, but eventually in God's time, that's a very long time. So, you know, only an idiot would say, okay, well, I'm going to go to hell and pay my sins, because you might be there for thousands and thousands of years. And, you know, that's just idiotic. And even in Islamic theology, there are many that insist that while heaven is eternal, hell's not. But going back to that critical concept that Allah, I think those who basically said that Allah in the Quran uses language that we can relate to, but once you remove the laws of physicality, the laws of physics as we know them. There are what does a fire mean in that context? I can imagine situations where if you exist day in and day out, confronted with the ugliness of your own deeds, even if you have to live a lifetime equal to the lifetime you lived on this earth, paying for your sins, it's horrendous. I mean, it's truly terrifying. I think people just don't think about how horrific it is to confront one's own sins, because we often limit our understanding of our sins to the way we think it affects things. But if you take the perspective, let's say, of a computer, let's not even say God, but a computer, and let's say this computer has perfect knowledge of how every infraction ripples through, that's truly terrifying, because then you can see all the ripple effects of everything through the ages, and sin becomes far more scary, because there's hardly anything you can do in the existence that doesn't affect everyone else. It's just the nature of it. Everything you do affects everything else. And I think Allah took every opportunity in the Quran, as Allah has done in every revelation, to communicate to us that our life would cease to have meaning if it wasn't heading to the ultimate purpose of the achievement of justice. Once you take justice out of the equation, and that's why, subhanAllah, I've said this before, but I've been fascinated by how especially you find this in Christianity, the number of people who live horrible lives of crime, and then once they're caught, they say, I know that I'm saved. I've accepted Jesus Christ, and so I'm saved. And it's so selfish, because they don't think of the rights of the victims. So many serial killers, you hear that. Well, how about your victim? Well, I'm saved. Jesus Christ, I've accepted it. Well, how about the rights of the victims? No one talks about that. Is that a merciful God? Is that compassion? I don't think so. I don't think that's merciful or compassionate, to just forgive people regardless of what they've done. Not in the real, true understanding of compassion and mercy.
Just to start too, I think alhamdulillah, it's so amazing because we're getting 2 of these halakas per week, but I feel like it also becomes so easy to take for granted the fact that we're getting just every single one of these halakas. It's amazing, and may Allah help us really internalize each message, because when it comes at this speed, it's gets difficult to remember how lucky we are. But so the question I have, I'm sorry, I don't know if this is as much as a question as if there's more to elaborate on it, but I thought the point that you made in your summary was really fascinating about the problem of thinking of God through the lens of, optics of a kingdom, and just, submit to God like you would submitting a king. And I was wondering if you can just elaborate on this, because I know a lot of us are taught that, you have to submit to God, because if you don't submit to God, naturally you're going to submit to your ego, you're going to submit to money, you're going to submit to a political figure, which all in all might be very much truthful, and I think that is a fact, but in my eyes it comes at a very basic level of understanding worship. So, and that verse, I think it was verse 30, 33 and 34, is that why it says in this verse, truly they did not believe in God, and they did not urge feeding the poor, because it's saying that there is no belief in God unless you're upholding justice. And that's what differs from the optics of a kingdom where, you know, you're just submitting for the will of it, but with Allah, you're doing it because of substantive morals and ethics. So I was wondering if there's anything more you can add to that.
But no, I'm happy you're flagging this, because time and time, and I think this is, I mean, it is not what a lot of you know, a lot of Muslims ignore, or in the way we teach them Islam, at least we ignore, and in turn they ignore. What is the first thing that the Prophet ﷺ does when he goes to Medina? He does the concept of mu'akhah, where he basically says, it is as if you are brothers, it is as if you are sisters. And the concept of mu'akhah itself, inherent in it, was the obligation for mutual care. And in addition to this, the whole institution of mawali, that anyone that comes to society that doesn't have a community attachment, they get a community attachment assigned to them, where that community becomes responsible for their care. In addition to that, we know that so many people converted to Islam, came to Medina, and were poor, and they became known as Ahl al-Suffa, the people who lived in the mosque in Medina. They didn't have homes, they just lived in the mosque in Medina. And the Prophet ﷺ and other Muslims would feed them. And it's remarkable because everyone knew that there were very devout people like Bilal, but there were also people who were not devout. They just came because they knew they get a free ride. But yet, we don't have a single incident where the Prophet ﷺ says to any of them, "Oh, you just came here because you're poor and you actually don't believe in Islam." And when you look at the details, that's why the way you interpret history is so important. Because I believe that if you actually look at the micro level dynamics of how that Islamic message got translated into practice, you'll find that at so many levels, everything translated to, quite simply, you cannot enjoy a fancy meal if other people are hungry. You cannot just simply, and that's why in at least the entire time that not just Medina, not just life of the Prophet ﷺ, but even after the death of the Prophet, no one in Medina dared build a fancy home. I mean, it is one of the most remarkable things is that they knew that it's just not what you do. If you did that, you would become the object of criticism. Like, why do you have so much money to spend on yourself when there are so many social needs? And this doesn't just happen. Especially, these are people who, as Arabs, lived a class system. What they were accustomed to was a tribal system, an ethnic system, a class system. Huge disparities in wealth was anchored in their culture. And it is, you only ignore the reality that the Quran is what created this sociological experiment. Only if you ignore what the Quran says. Because the Quran repeatedly, it tells you, whether it calls it فك الرقبة, or calls it, sorry, Al-Aqaba, but that it is what earns you liberation in the hereafter, or whether it equates Iman Billah into a translation into good deeds. And good deeds are not some theoretical thing, but actual material difference. I think the way we reconstructed the seerah, the way we retell the seerah, is where we're acting as interpretive agents. And as interpretive agents, we either are focusing on moral dynamics, or we ignore to choose moral dynamics. And in Surah Al-Haqqah, it is quite remarkable that if you take the entire surah as itself, total, what you end up with is accountability gives meaning to your earthly life, and إحقاق الحق or إحقاق الحقوق, إحقاق الحقائق. And accountability, Al-Haqqah, gives meaning to your earthly life and gives meaning to what your society is about. And more than that, it gives meaning to your belief in Allah Al-Azim. If your belief in Allah doesn't translate into... I was just reading this thing about a sheikh in Egypt, and this sheikh, was supposed to be some Sufi guy, and he's supposed to be the Sisi's advisor, the president of Egypt. And okay, so you have, and this sheikh was saying, he wrote something about that. He's praising Sufism, and Sufism is very different than the Ikhwan who are kuffar, and the Salafis who are horrible, and and I kept thinking, okay, so as a sheikh, supposedly a great Sufi, you don't prevent the execution of people. You don't prevent the oppression of the poor. You don't make any difference in the morality or justice of your society. You completely lend support to the oppressive policies and tyrannical policies of the government that is replete with injustice. Then what is the value of this Sufism? What is the value of this piety? Why would I listen to anything the sheikh has to say? His name is Al-Azhari, something Al-Azhari. He's very well known in Egypt. And the difference between us and the followers of the Islamic message at the time of the Prophet ﷺ is exactly that. They innately knew that if you end up embodying so much injustice, your iman is pointless. We forgot that, and that's why we are in the trouble we're in our day and age.
Great question. Any more? Okay, because I want to get to this question here. Thank you, Huda, for asking it. Assalamu alaikum. Could you please talk more about the meaning of Ayah 17 and Razi's interpretation? Does it refer to 8 different forms of power or intellect? Please discuss it more. And then also Joe's follow-up, you can throw it in here. Following up on Huda's question, there are both 8 days in verse 7 and 8 angels in verse 17. Does the number 8 have a special significance in numerology? Is this noticed and discussed in the commentaries, or does the professor have any thoughts on this?
Wow, okay.
Oh, and what's the dhikr? Sorry, before you jump into that.
This one, I mean, the entire Surah Al-Haqqah is a dhikr. You could do a dhikr with Surah Al-Haqqah, the very last ayah, if you don't have time to do the entire surah. But Surah Al-Haqqah is really, and incidentally, I forgot to say that we again have so many reports about how often the Prophet ﷺ would recite Surah Al-Haqqah in prayer, and would part of his wasiyah, part of his like what he taught Muslims to do, is that he told them to recite Surah Al-Haqqah a lot, like Surah Al-Mulk. Both of these surah are. Okay, first the. Can I? Okay, can you ask Koda something? Can you ask her if she read something about what the 8 intellect meanings of intellect, or is this just a coincidence?
No, she didn't.
Wow. Okay. Okay. So what occurred to you is something that.
Oh wait, Joe. This is a question from Joe and Huda. So
Yeah,
Joe
but
is
no,
asking- okay.
Joe's asking about numerology
Yeah.
and yeah.
Okay.
But first, yeah, that question about if those who are carrying okay, so there is a hadith that I didn't quote it because I have my suspicions about its authenticity. That says that there are 4 that carry the throne of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that in the final day, instead of 4, there will be 8. Now, while the hadith itself is of dubious authenticity, that narrative of 4 and then 8 gave it inspired a long discussion about the 4 quintessential elements, and then the 4 additional quintessential elements for a realization of a rububiyyah, a realization of godliness on earth. So, I'm not sure if I'm going to remember them, but it is Al-Aql, Al-Nafs, Al-Ruh, Al-Aql, Al-Nafs, Al-Ruh. So the Ruh is the soul, the spirit, the intellect, and what's the 4th? I forget. I have very I believe it is الشعور or المشاعر. It's the ability. It's the senses. The ability to absorb through the senses. And I don't actually remember all the 8. But they talk about that when you are trying to achieve godliness within, that you have to work at the first 4 and then the further 4, which are all derived from each of the basic 4. So in other words, so for instance, the intellect. First, you train the intellect to think what we would call in our language today, to think without projecting the self or the ego upon its analysis of what is right and wrong. What completes the intellect, the further step, is an actual pursuit of knowledge. And they have a similar discussion about the ruh, they have a similar discussion about the nafs, and that these are all necessary elements. So when Allah says that there are 8 carrying the thrones, that this is all allegorical to telling us what would be needed to achieve godliness in life. Now, the questions about numerology, the answer, I don't remember if it's in Tafsir al-Najmi, but it is in that Tafsir, the big green one. I forgot the title of that Tafsir. No. It's called غرائب القرآن ورغائب الفرقان by Naisaburi. And he talks about the numerology of the number 8. And he... Grace spilled.
This is typical.
Classic.
They know me
Alhamdulillah,
now.
you didn't spill it on me though.
Oh no. Don't say that, I might. Okay. Sorry. Numerology.
I'm not a numerology person, so I wouldn't be able to repeat it or comment on it, but I just know that it exists, and it's really the discussions on numerology. They pull up facts that I find. I mean, it's fascinating, but I've never gotten into it to be able to say anything meaningful about it.
Okay, so now that you've just kind of whet our appetites, because I don't know if that was enough for you. It wasn't enough for me. So I don't know, can we ask for more maybe if you have a chance? Because this is so fascinating to go.
More about what?
About the 4 and the 4. The things that you couldn't remember.
You know, I subhanAllah, I was looking at I had notes on it, and I was looking at it, and then I thought to myself, no, I'll just cut it out, and it won't even come up, I'm sure. And then, of course, it comes up. Yeah, I can look it up. I can. I mean, wait. It will take too long if I look for it now, so I would have to.
As a follow-up, because this is, will this topic come up again? Is it raised in other?
No, not the number 8, but these elements they do come up. Yeah, the elements do come up.
The elements is what I was referring to, less so than the numerology.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, okay. So here's okay, so they say there are 7. This is just from this school of thought that they say Sifat. It's one of the Sufi-esque approaches, but it's different than the one that I was explaining. So it's say الصفات السبع الإلهية وهي الحياة والعلم والإرادة والقدرة والسمع والبصر والكلام. So you say there are 7 divine elements that one must understand. Life, knowledge, will, irada, will. Qudra is ability or like energy. والسمع hearing والبصر is sight والكلام is speech. وفي الإشارة إلى الثمان الطبيعية and the eight the eight things that would prevent one from reaching the seven divinities or corruptions of the of divinity. And these are ghadab, anger, shahwa, desire, improper desire, wal-hiqd, spite, wal-hasad, envy, and bukhl is miserliness, wal-jubn, cowardliness, wal-ajab is arrogance. So this is just one. This is this is different than the four and the derivative four, but so where's the derivative one? الوجود والحياة والعلم والقدر والسمع والبصر والكلام. Let me look it up because I'm not finding it because I'm stuck. But you know, it's just it's dangerous to not. I don't want to say dangerous, but though lists, when people make lists, sometimes they think that just by having the list that they've actually reached something. It is much better to understand the concept than memorize the list. Memorizing the list doesn't get you anywhere. Extracting the soul of the thing is what is most important.
Can you, from last halaqah, after last halaqah, you told me a part about the yaqteen tree that I didn't record. Can you say that now?
Oh, okay. The last halqa was Surah the Safa. Rami, do you know how to bring the...
Joe, what number is Safat?
69.
No, that's
Right?
this one.
Is it this one? Oh, it
You
was
remember?
37?
I had like
37.
a little things that I copied and put on the side when I was preparing for Safa. Is that erased or is it still there?
No, it's still there. What number?
37.
Actually, yeah. Yeah.
Joe, it's 37.
Joe
Thank you,
nods?
Joe. Yeah, he put it in the
course,
chat.
So, what Sharif was referring to is, it's I don't remember what Sharif was asking, but there is a narrative about Shajarat al-Yaqteen. If you remember, I told you that the Prophet Yunus, alayhi salam, God tells him that, okay, the people that you have rejected your message for so long, they're going to be destroyed, and that he leaves town, and goes. And a lot of reports is that he goes to a location. Now, just it's a matter of time before God's punishment befalls these people. And that when they see God's punishment coming, they freak out and they repent, and so they're not punished. And according to some narratives, this angers the Prophet Yunus alayhi salam, and that's why in anger he decides to get on a ship and go to a new land, and then he's swallowed by a whale, then he is spat out and ends up on somewhere where a tree of yaqteen grows, or the tree of yaqteen exists, and it is what saves his life. And in one of these reports, Yunus develops a fondness towards that tree. I mean, after all, it saved his life, and it is. But eventually, that tree dies. And when the tree of Yaqteen dies, Yunus is very sad, and he cries for the death of the tree. And according to this narrative, that then Allah sends an angel that tells Yunus, you cry for the tree that died, but you were not sad about the 100,000 people who were going to be destroyed. In other words, you had pity for the tree, but you didn't have pity for the 100,000 people who were going to be destroyed. And Yunus then realizes that part of his sin is that he allowed himself to get angry and vindictive towards the people that he was sent to. So that's the narrative that Sharif was referring to. The other thing I skipped last halaqah, when in Surah Al-Safat, I'm pretty sure this is from Ibn Ajiba. So, commenting on, I believe it was, hold on a second, at the very end of Surah Al-Safat, where it says, فإذا نزل بصحتهم ساء صباح المنذرين وتولى عنهم حتى حين وابصر فسوف يبصرون سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. This is the very end of Surah Al-Safat. So Ibn Ajiba says, ترى بعض الناس يقول لو ظهر شيخ التربية لكنا من المخلصين بصحبته وخدمته فلما ظهر كل الظهور جحد وكفر وأنف واستكبر وقنع بما عنده من علم فإذا رأى ما ينزل بأهل النسبة من أصحابه من الامتحان في أول البادية قال ليس هذا طريق الولاية فيقال له وقد سبقت كلمتنا لعبادنا المرسلين ولمن كان على قدمهم إنهم لهم المنصورون وإن جندنا لهم الغالبون فتولى عن مثل هذا حتى حين وهو وقت هجوم الموت إلى خلق. So what he's saying is that there are people that they like, that what he's getting at is that in Surah Al-Safat it talks about turning away from the ignorant, and he says that part of the problem is that there are people who say, if Allah would just send a teacher my way, if Allah would just send someone that I can learn from, but then when Allah does send someone that they can learn from, جحد وكفر وأنف واستكبر means they become arrogant and they refuse وقنع بما عنده من علم. They become acquiescent or satisfied with what they know. They convince themselves that no, I know a lot and I'm fine. And they in fact refuse to, and especially when do they refuse to learn? Especially when they see how hard the path of knowledge is. So he says, فإذا رأى ما ينزل بأهل النسبة من أصحابه, that when he sees how hard it is for someone to walk the path of learning and to actually study at the hands of a sheikh, or they convince themselves that no, I'm knowledgeable enough, and they convince themselves that whatever the reasons are, that, and they turn away. And what he's saying is that when Surah Al-Safat say salam and turn away from them, he's saying that these souls, these people who are like that, they break what they promised Allah. And he's talking about especially teachers walking in the footsteps of prophets. Say salam to them and just turn away. Don't try to get them to do the right thing, because there is a deep flaw in their character that prevents them from the type of humility needed for learning. So I know that I've skipped that, and I felt guilty about skipping it since last Haqqah, because I was getting tired, and I knew that if you guys knew that I skipped it, I would be in trouble. So, so there it is.
Alhamdulillah. Thank you so much. And on that note, I think we've gone actually over time, but it was so valuable. So thank you so much. Thank you for everyone's questions, and really looking forward to meeting again, inshallah, on Saturday. But hopefully we'll see you Friday for the khutbah.
So we're praying for Joe to be back soon.
And we're praying for Joe to be back. You guys hang on for a second. And then that's it. Thank you. Alhamdulillah. That was wonderful. It's already 10:30.
Who's you guys hang for a second? All of them?
Well, there's just a few, handful.
Oh, handful.
So we'll just say hello very quickly.
Okay.
Okay. So, because it's already late.
So
it's almost 10:30.
Don't hang up yet.
Don't hang up yet. Okay. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Thank you so much for another wonderful session. Alhamdulillah.